We're going to have a great day today. I know there was a lot of information presented yesterday. So if you're joining us for the first time, you'll definitely want to consult that recording when you have a chance to. But today there's definitely going to be some activities and ability and time to ask questions. Again, let's still take the approach when we're having the presentation portion. Feel free to use the chat box. That'll help us streamline things for questions. Like I said, we will have opportunities to be in small groups or one-on-one with the presenters or in a group with the presenters that you can ask questions verbally in that way. And yeah, just a couple quick reminders from Michigan Nonprofit Association. Of course, I hope you're familiar with us by now. If you're not, we're the statewide association for nonprofits. We serve the sector through advocacy, training, and resources, and we do that with a focus on our values of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. We have 2 community conversations, which are going to be talking about the topic of imposter syndrome coming up this Friday. We'd love to have you join either one of those. And then next week, on the 4th is, on May 4th is our monthly Member Connect, which will be talking about using survey data to create programs. And again, we are trying our best to support nonprofits through the COVID-19 pandemic, and you can find some really cool resources at mnacovidresponse.org, that website. And now, without any further ado, I will turn it over to Carol and Nikki, who are going to start us off on second day of this indirect cost rate training.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second day. I'm so happy all you guys came back because this is like the fun part in terms of kind of putting it all together. A lot of yesterday was, explanation and boring verbiage from the uniform guidance and all those kinds of things. So hopefully today will help with a little bit of application, which will allow you guys to get a better understanding of how we're approaching this and what good process and approaches for you guys are to try to take some of your information and be able to negotiate a rate. So I'm going to finish the last couple of slides that are just a couple of examples at a high level, which will feed right into what we're doing with the exercises. Once I have finished the slides, what we're going to do is we have a few handouts which are in the chat room that you guys can download. And we're going to begin to start to build out an indirect cost rate and give you examples of how things are different in the different approaches, and then kind of getting some ideas of, how you're applying certain costs to direct or indirect, that type of thing, and what the value or benefit is with the different ways. So that will be following these last couple slides, and we're going to break out into breakout rooms. So that you'll be working, we're trying to put about 3 in a breakout room, and so they have that set up, and we'll just go into some breakout rooms. You guys can work together on the spreadsheet, and we'll give you ample amount of time to do that, and then we can come back and ask questions on each area. We have time for all of that, so you can ask questions on, what we just worked on, or specifics to your own organization or things that you're struggling with. So that's what our process of today is going to be. Okay, next slide. Okay, so maximizing your indirect cost even when there's a cap. So this is the thing that I think a lot of agencies think about when they're looking into, is it worth our benefit to negotiate a rate? Because there's an admin cap on our services for whatever program or grant we're working on. So I always like to reiterate the ability to access dollars that you were awarded. And so this is why negotiating an indirect cost rate is so important. you know, we talked about yesterday for the sustainability aspect of things, but here's an opportunity for you as an organization to really look at, are there any dollars that have been left on the table that I might be able to gain access to fill some of the gaps, especially because of COVID-19. If you lost any revenues or you're struggling as an organization to, you know, stay afloat, this is an opportunity that might be very interesting to you guys in terms of, you know, why it's valuable to go through this process of negotiation. So if your grant has a administrative cap, let's say 5 or 10%, but you have a NICRA, which is that negotiated indirect cost rate. For our example, you'll see here, this is a very large grant, obviously, but in this instance, they were awarded, the agency was awarded $5 million with an admin cap of 10%. But they were only able to draw down in the given grant year 2.5 million, which in turn translated into 250,000 of indirect cost. Whatever reason it is, many times there's timing, there's resources, there's the ability to apply the program and get it up and running. So there are times when you leave money, you are awarded more than you're able to access. And so with that, you have an opportunity to go backwards. So as long as the grant is not closed, you have the ability to go back 2 years and access the additional indirect cost that might not have been attributable so to the amount that you've spent. So if you look at your drawdown on the actuals, you actually had 2.5 million. So for this organization, they had a 37.5% indirect cost rate. So their actual indirect cost that they put forth was 937,500. So you'll see that in the middle in the blue box. So that is just simply applying that 37.5 to the 2.5 million of direct cost. And so that's really what it took to support those dollars was the 937. So what you'll notice is because the admin cap was at the 500,000, for 10%, and you didn't fully access all those dollars, you only got 250 of the 500, there's still 250,000 left on the grant for that administrative dollar. So because you can prove that you have a negotiated rate and that rate is 37.5, you're able to access that additional 250,000. So again, you're still going to end up subsidizing some, but you can access that additional 250. So what the idea behind it is you go back and see if there's any unspent dollars on your grant, and then you have the ability to apply your negotiated indirect cost rate and get the remaining available administrative dollars. Because the idea is that you actually really did spend even more than that on so they have limited the amount of indirect costs that you could get at 10%, but that's equal based on your award to 500,000.
Can I ask you a question before you move on?
Yes, absolutely.
If your grant allows you an extension, would it make more sense to not do the extension and take the remaining admin? Or would it make more sense to continue the program, spend down the money, and not take that additional admin? Just a kind of a question of
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. If you have an extension, I would recommend continuing to spend down on the grant as you are with your direct cost. And then at the end of it, again, if there's anything left over, then go through this process. But I would continue with the extension to just continue on that route because you'll get the direct dollars and you want to make sure that you are accessing every possible dollar you can along the way. Okay, are there any other questions on this particular exercise?
And I have one more follow-up question, sorry.
Sure. No, please.
If you had a grant that closed out 2 years ago and you closed it out and gave money back, so this is applicable to that situation. You can go back and
yeah. So as long, yeah.
Even if you didn't have a NICRA at that time.
Well, you have to negotiate it. You have to get it negotiated first, and it has to be applicable to that given year. But when you go and you negotiate a NICRA, for many agencies that I work with, when I go in the first year, if they haven't had one, I go back 2 years and negotiate 3 different rates. So I get them current, but I go backwards so that I can access those dollars. So you would go and do 3 rates based on 3 different fiscal years. So it has to be that the rate is applicable to the given year that you're trying to apply it to. But you can negotiate multiple rates at the same time. And it's actually, pretty straightforward for the negotiator, because once you create a rate, it's just updating the financials. So it's the same process. So for them, they negotiate one rate. Negotiating 3 isn't going to be much more to them because it's all done in the same format and, process or whatever. So, when you're getting caught up, if you had a rate negotiated, let's say 3 years ago, and then you just didn't bother to negotiate the last couple of years, they probably would push back on going backwards and negotiating. But if you've never had a rate, then that's when you can go back and say, okay, I'm going to get caught up. Here's, the rates here. And especially if we were doing that fixed with carry forward that I went over yesterday, what ends up happening is it's perfect because I'll just go back 2 years. There'll be no carry forward in those first 2 years because there's nothing to base it off of. There was no prior rate. But then the third year, which ends up being your current year that you're using it for, will now have a dollar amount that it can use as a carry forward. So now you're all caught up with your carry forward, and everything is, in line with moving forward.
Perfect. Thank you for the explanation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any questions? All right, we'll move to the next slide.
Sorry, I was trying to type it up really quick, but so if you did that,
no
then
worries.
you'd have a prior period adjustment. You'd have a prior period adjustment, right? If you did that.
Yeah, you can do that. I've heard this is a common question for agencies. They don't necessarily want to go back 2 years and do an adjustment. So there is a way. I'm not the accountant, but I know that I've been on the phone with many accountants that talked about it, and they said, okay, we know how to do this for not going backwards, but let's take it offline. So I didn't really hear the final explanation, but I know that for accounting purposes, you don't have to go back 2 years and do an adjustment to your already closed financials and audited and all that. There's a way that you can account for those dollars in the current year, even though it was for past expenditures. Carol would probably have a better
I think it really
on that.
depends on whether or not you fully closed out that grant, really, to tell you the truth. Because in one way, I would just apply it with the carry forward to the current year.
Okay.
But if it was a closed grant, I definitely believe you would have to do a prior period adjustment.
All right.
Thank you.
One other thing I do want to mention, because we found this when we were going through negotiating rates. If you haven't, it's one thing if you haven't used all your money, but if you negotiate a rate and you really have used the money, it really is up to the federal awarding agency whether or not to allow you to apply that rate. And it's really based on whether or not there's any funding left in that grant. Okay. And it's the same thing if you're a pass-through. So there's a little disclaimer statement, whatever you want to call it, and at the bottom that says it is definitely based on whether or not there is still appropriation authority available for them to increase your award. So a lot of these depend on whether it's closed out or it's a 3-year grant, right, with a different budget every year, which is another thing they updated because of all the confusion between the budget period and the period of performance. And that's been updated in the revisions.
All right. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So the next one is applying the match, using your indirect cost rate as your match component. So I know Carol talked to this yesterday and talked about how you would use your, that you can kind of divide your indirect cost rate to use for different purposes. And this is a way of also then maximizing your opportunity for reimbursement. So in this example, there's $1 million grant with a 25% match, so it requires $250,000. With this, in this particular agency, there was a 22% indirect cost rate. So there wasn't the ability to fully cover the 25% with the indirect cost rate, but they were able to cover 220,000 of that. And then they would just have to come up with 30,000 rather than the 250,000. So this particular situation, there was no administrative dollars allowed, but then they were still able to use their indirect cost rate as their match component. So again, it's freeing up dollars for you to be able to apply your indirect cost rate instead of putting dollars aside for your match component that you would have had to find from other areas or subsidize in another way. One of the other things that I think is really important to look at is not only does this help you for your existing grants, because maybe you don't even have any match requirement grants, but this frees up or gives you the opportunity to go after more. So a lot of agencies have avoided grants that have match requirements because they simply don't have the cash to set aside for the grant when they apply. So this allows you to now look at an opportunity to say, can we access new funding that we otherwise would have passed up because we now have this negotiated rate sitting there ready to use for any future match requirement grant. So that's something also to consider, another benefit to having the indirect cost rate available to you. It's not only for your existing portfolio, it's also very beneficial for future opportunities as well. Okay, next slide. So this is the conversation of where you would divide or split up your indirect cost rate to use in two different ways. In this particular grant, the agency has a 37.5% rate that's negotiated. The grant has an admin cap of 10% and a match requirement of 25. So when they have an admin cap, that will be used first. So that you will fill that responsibility with your indirect cost rate first, so you get your 10%. And then what remains is 27.5% for this agency that you could use on your match. So if the match was a 50% or a 30%, you wouldn't have enough, but in this case, it was a 25%. So you still have enough to cover the match as well as the 10% administrative cap. And so in this case, you're really maximizing every opportunity to get the funding that you need to, so you're not subsidizing any part of the grant that you otherwise would have. So you now are only really subsidizing 2.5% of the indirect cost because you had that ability to use it as the match component. So are there any questions on that?
Can you talk about, in terms of match requirement, is it 20%, or sorry, is it the percentage on top of the ask, or is it a total amount? That makes sense. So in terms of applying the indirect cost rate.
So I think what you're saying is when you have a requirement, whatever they have set forth, the funder has set forth as a requirement for match, are you saying, you know, can you use your whole rate, or are you saying, is that what you're saying on the match requirement?
Yeah.
Or is there some kind of split that you have to use with? Yeah, so you can use your entire indirect cost rate as your match. And if it fully covers it, so like if your rate is higher than the match requirement, you're completely set. You have no other dollars that you need to set aside. The idea behind it is this is the federal government's acknowledgement that they understand it's costing agencies dollars, you know, to support these grants. So they're saying that is you putting forth dollars because you're putting forth the indirect support. So that's why they allow you to use with prior approval, as Carol always says, that they allow you to use the indirect cost rate as a complete application to that match requirement. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You can
So,
see you're
yeah,
still
so the
processing.
way that I get around that whole gargly goop is, you know, it meets all the matching requirements because you're using your own money, you know what I mean? So all those match requirements it meets, and they are recognizing that, you know, they do have a cap and a matching component. And so since you already spent that money, whatever you have that is over that cap, you can use to meet your match because you've spent it from your own money.
Does that apply to state, federal, and local grants, any municipal grant, or is it strictly federal for this, the match?
Well, it's really strictly federal. Okay. And when you say state grants, are you talking about state grants from state appropriations or pass through of federal funding?
I guess either.
Yeah, well, it would only pertain to federal funding. Now in Illinois, we passed a law that said you had to follow the federal rules for state grants. So, you know, then you can
When you
do-
say we, do you mean state and local?
Yeah, so what we did is say, you know, we had a bunch of groups such as you guys self, because we had a lot of support from the National Council of Nonprofits, and they wanted to have one set of rules because it was so confusing to them, especially when, you know, there's state dollars, federal dollars, you know. So we said, okay, since we have to follow them for federal, let's follow them for state, and we passed a law stating that. So it did make everybody's life easier. And you're seeing more and more of it. You know, like I went and testified before the City Council of Washington, D.C., and I also did it in Maryland, and they with indirect costs, and they listened, and they chose to adopt the federal rules as it pertains to cost principles, and you know, and all the appendices for indirect costs.
One other follow-up question with that, when you're actually putting this into practice, and I will say Friends of the Rouge does have a negotiated indirect cost rate, but we just got it. Thanks to Karen, our operations director, who is on this call. But just learning kind of how to use it right now is another piece of it. And also communicating that to staff and then to funders who aren't used to seeing it is also something that I'm interested in as well, because it's definitely a leap to see little old Friends of the Rouge asking for, you know, a NICRA rate and as an overhead. And it definitely bumps up the hourly rate that we're kind of asking for, much more than they're used to. So any advice on that would be helpful too.
So if I understand your question, it's just getting the buy-in is what you're talking about.
Yeah, not only buy-in, but you know, when you're putting in an application, is there sort of boilerplate language that talks about the use of indirect cost rate within this grant proposal that can be, you know, this organization has an indirect cost rate and we are applying it as X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and so if you look, they really did word it better because there's so much confusion over it. But if you look at the new revisions that they put on pass-through, because before, you know, the way it was written, a lot of people were confused that they didn't have to do it as a pass-through, okay? And so now if you don't do it, you're violating federal regulations. Okay? So that's a number one, you know, thing. The other thing is, I know, especially the first time you do it, okay? And because your grant application, your budget, you know what I mean, is not showing that. If you haven't, it's always nice to have it beforehand. Number one, they cannot penalize you for your indirect cost rate, okay? They that cannot be taken into account when they grade your application. It's very competitive and, or, you know, discretionary. But you know, the other thing is knowing that's what you're going to be up against when you put in your application. If you're passing money through, you know, you have to make sure, as well as yourself, that you calculate out based on that indirect cost rate what it is, so it's all covered in there, as well as anybody else you're passing money through to. So
I see. Do you have to take into account
that people seem to have problems getting over. They want to spend more money on the program and not admin.
So are you saying, Carol, and just to clarify, that when you are acting as a fiscal agent or the primary grantee with subcontractors that also have a negotiated indirect cost rate, they get to have that passed through to them as well?
So there's so many different nuances with a fiscal agent. So what exactly is your definition? I've heard fiscal agent, fiscal sponsor, and they all mean different things to different people.
So we'll say, for example, we're a sub-recipient awardee of a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant.
Okay.
Say we are, and we
Okay.
have a NICRA. Can we then impose our NICRA to the primary grant awardee?
Yes, you can. And
Okay.
they must accept that rate.
And then alternatively, if we are the primary holder of the grant for National Fish and Wildlife Federation funding, and we have Henry Ford Health Systems, which is a nonprofit, as a sub-grant awardee, if they have a NICRA, we have to honor their NICRA when we pass the money through to them.
That's correct. And
Correct.
if they don't have a NICRA, you're responsible for negotiating one with them.
If they want it, or we have to?
You have to. You cannot force them to take that 10% de minimis rate. And if you go back through the slides, we cover that. They must accept your rate, whether or not. Now, one of the new items that they added this year with the revisions, I guess it was last year, is that if they have a negotiated rate with another pass-through entity and not federal, because if you don't get federal funds, the feds will not negotiate a rate with you if you don't get them directly. So you can collaborate with them and look at it and see if you would accept that rate negotiated. That's the one that makes me a little, I don't know, a little nervous on that one, because I've seen some of the stuff where people say they're experts, and then when we ask to see everything, they are not following the rules at all. But you can negotiate. What we did in Illinois was centralize it, and we just hired a firm to come in and do it. Okay, so they would come in and they would help negotiate that rate. But yes, that's what it means. And you can do it in collaboration, okay, on what you believe, but those are the requirements.
I have so many questions. I'm going to stop asking.
I know it's very confusing in the beginning. I mean, it really is.
So
if
yeah, so this is one of the things.
I was just
going to say, Carol, like you guys can jump off, like into a chat room later and ask more specific questions if you want.
Yeah. Okay.
And then that way you can still get your questions answered. We will have time for that after our exercises. So, we can go ahead and do that. I did see that there was another question from Ellen, whether is this only applicable if you have a negotiated rate, or does it apply to selected use of the de minimis? And that, again, it does not apply to the de minimis. So you cannot use de minimis as your match. You only can use it for your match if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate. So that's, again, one of the benefits of having that and going through the process. It does not work in any other case for application on the match. Okay, any other questions?
If you, sorry, I have one more, because it's actually very pertinent to something.
No, you're totally fine.
Very second.
Yeah.
And if you are, so we are the grant awardee for a National Fish and Wildlife Federation grant. And it is partially federally funded, partially state funded, partially foundation funded. I'm assuming the NICRA can apply to that. But if you're passing money to a subcontractor who's assisting you in a project, they would be eligible for your NICRA or their own NICRA. No. Okay. Carol, you are.
You're on mute. You're on mute, Carol. Carol, mute.
All right, he's talking to my mute button, but that's a two-pronged question. number one, contracts or subcontractors don't get indirect cost rates.
Okay.
For purposes of what you're doing. I mean, there are some things that we won't even get into when it comes to the procurement rules and the cost accounting standards and everything else with contracting. Okay.
Okay.
That should be already built into their price. All right. So, you know, no, you wouldn't. And the other thing is only you can use your own NICRA. Nobody else can use yours. And that's a great question because a lot of people get confused about that. Since they applied for the grant and this is my rate, excellent question. Then my subrecipients can use my rate. No, that is not true. They have to negotiate their own.
It's a good sort of a good follow-up question from Jennifer about confirming or reviewing their rates if they're applying their NICRA. But would that just be like assumed if they're a contractor that it's built into their rate?
Yes.
You know, we just get a general rate, and I know that NICRA is included, but it's not broken out. So I guess that answers the question, which is it's just their billable hours that we're reviewing. Is that correct?
And we don't have to confirm that they have a NICRA. We can just like be like, yeah, sure, that's your rate kind of thing.
If it's a contract, no, this is for grants. Okay. There's other rules for procurement. If you have huge contracts that you got to follow on cost standards. Okay. But I'm sure for your purposes, they would just be like a contractor. They are not a grant. So you have to do that grant versus contractor versus subrecipient checklist and make sure that they're not really a subrecipient. Because if they are, you know, then they're required to follow all of the grant rules. If they're a contractor, you're just required to follow the procurement rules within the uniform guidance. Okay.
All right, next slide. I think that's the last one. Yep. So this is just, you know, what appendix you can reference in terms of calculating your indirect cost rates. It will give you the different things that we did earlier in the slide. But now I think it's time for us to move to the exercises. So as I mentioned before in the chat, there should be I see the different files that Sarah had sent. There's one called CPS Training Tool Blank. That's the one we're going to start with. So I can go ahead and pull it up on my screen so that you guys can see it and what we're looking at, except for this one's not blank. So I'm going to change that. Hold on one second.
All right, Nikki, while you're doing that, I'll just go into what we're going to do here. We really, I really worked on this example for years and we've tried to tweak it and improve it every time. So what we did is take some, you know, reasonable costs for these areas and try to zone in on where people seem to struggle in some of the accounts. Some of them are very easy to do. So the first part, when you go out in the breakout room, what you really need to do is look at these from a perspective of this is a direct and this is an indirect, not really taking the direct allocation as we've talked about, but just to put them in either as direct, indirect, or unallowable. Okay. So we, again, have put some stuff in here that tends to, you know, people tend to have difficulty with, and some of it's really straightforward. So this is what we're going to do in the breakout room. So we just want you to come up and take these, and we'll be popping in and out of those rooms to give you any assistance. But this is the first step. And if you use the de minimis rate, you'd have to, you know, the only difference is the other activities that you would put in as direct. But we didn't list those, you know, a lot of those in here. So that's what, anything else?
And so yeah, you're going to click on the simplified tab. There's a tab that says simplified. And as Carol mentioned, we're just simply right now, we're not really worrying about a rate. We're worrying about what each line item pertains to. So based on what your thought process is, why you thought this should be direct or indirect is what we kind of want you to think about as you go through the process, because this is where it's really going to help you in applying it to your own costs, is being able to think of it from the reasons why. That's always what is necessary in terms of a justification. If you're ever asked, or if you're ever questioned, because in my career, with negotiating with all the different cognizant agencies, I have made determinations that this is a direct or this is an indirect, and then I've had pushback from agencies that talk about whether or not, or from different cognizant agencies, whether or not they believe the same thing. So you always need to have a reason or a justification for why you decided, usually they're questioning the indirect. So why something is considered indirect in your case, because you have to understand that every organization is unique. And so what might be one for one person is different for another. And so you can feel confident in how you approach it as long as you have a reasonable justification for that, and that you can articulate that to the cognizant agency. So that's something that's important. So we want you, when you go through this, when we come back out, we want you to maybe ask questions. If you say, well, why was that considered indirect? I thought this was direct for this reason. And so there is multiple answers. So I just wanted to reiterate that before we hopped out.
Right, and we did the easy ones for you, the personnel cost.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're ready to break out, and I think Carrie's gonna do that for us. Is that correct?
1 second, and I'll send you all.
Thanks for that feedback. Appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Hi, everyone. All right. Well, I definitely hopped into some of the rooms and heard some really great conversations. So I'm glad you guys are collaborating and working together on that. So I think what we'll do is we'll share our screen with what we came up with for the simplified, and Carol can talk through that. And then I also want some of you guys to bring up some of the questions you were asking me, because I think they were great, and I'm sure everyone else has the same thought process in terms of, how do we differentiate, or can it be split, those kinds of things. So definitely ask questions so that we can, share with the whole group, because I think they were great. So let me share my screen.
Okay, I had some great questions as well, so anybody can bring those up. Although you feel like you're muddling around, as I told people, it's like, do this, go back, reread things, do this, go back, or you know what I mean? It's unfortunately, it takes a lot of, going through, and then once it's like ding, it becomes easier as you go, okay? Although you're always gonna have a ton of questions. So just going through this, and you have to remember this first one with the simplified method is just to break up what's direct and indirect, okay? So if we go through and, talk about, and most of them are definitely just the generalization of them. Almost every single one of these can have a mixed cost. You can charge some as direct and some as indirect. So just going through, we gave you the personnel, because somebody in one of the rooms I was in, she said, well, we have a fundraiser. So, that definitely goes in the unallowable. It does become a unallowable. You have to count as direct for purposes of calculating it. So I don't know.
Carol, let me interject really quickly.
Sure.
I just want to interject really quickly on that fundraising cost, because it's considered allowable. And what she means by it has to then be part of the direct is it has to become part of the direct cost pool. So when you are calculating your denominator, you have to bring in those costs, because they have to receive their fair share of indirect. So that's why, we mentioned it that way. But That being said, you also have to consider that not all unallowed costs have to be part of the direct cost pool. And so what the differentiation is it an operating cost or is it a pass-through? So for example, mortgage interest that's classified as unallowable would not have to be part of that direct cost base because of the fact that it's really just paying a bill of interest. It's not receiving support from all the other indirect services. So that's something to keep in mind when you're calculating your rate and what is in your direct cost pool and what is not. So any pass-through dollars that are not operating, so think about like you're just writing a check for something and you're not working on something, whereas like fundraising, you're doing an action. You're doing something to fundraise. So that is taking time and effort and indirect support, but mortgage interest is not.
And you also have to be careful on, some people just put the payment in. So, the principal and the interest. So you have to look at that as well. The way you get your money back on all of this is that it is depreciated. So if you own it, it's depreciated. If it's rent, you're paying the money out for purposes to support the program immediately. All right, so I don't know if I want to go through every single one of these. I think I just want to open it up to questions because I know we covered them pretty solid in some of the groups, and so, or the breakout rooms, I should say. So does anybody have any questions?
Does anyone want to share what they came up with?
Some people had difficulty. It was locked down and they couldn't put their information in.
Oh, really?
And I went to another room and they didn't have a problem. So I don't know what went on there.
I would like to just ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Direct cost and indirect cost. In my head, a direct cost means that you will be reimbursed by your contract. An indirect cost means that you will not be reimbursed by your contract. Am I looking at this incorrectly?
Well,
Yeah. Go ahead, Carol.
with all the examples we've been giving, it really depends on, if you have a negotiated rate, if there's any limitations, but you get the indirect cost back by either applying or part of it, by applying the de minimis rate, you get part of it, or negotiating a rate. So no, I don't know that I agree with that. Nikki?
Yeah, I would say that it's not as cut and dry as that, that you wouldn't get the indirect cost base back. It's about how you are able, if you have a negotiated rate, then what do you work with your funder on? Or because it's part of the cost of doing business. If you're a contractor, then it's built into your cost of doing business. But then also if there are limitations on that, you might only get a portion back. But you're correct in the direct aspect.
I ended up direct charging everything on a pro rata basis between indirect and direct. And there's been some question, I've had questions in the past. We allocate based on salaries, but then there's also the square foot allocation, which is not provided in this question. So that's a question. But most of our salaries are similar from person to person. And so I guess that's about the same. It would end up being the same math. But that's what I did. I direct charged a lot of it.
And so that is absolutely correct if you're doing like the direct allocation method. And so that's our next exercise where we're going to be doing that. So it's just that with the simplified, it's one or the other because they're just trying to get an indirect cost pool on a general basis. And that's why the rate you'll see is 56%. Because of what, it gets put into indirect and saying, okay, well, this is all indirect or this or unallowed. And so when we move on to our next example where we're doing the direct allocation, you're going to see that there is more of an ability to split. some costs are direct and indirect both. And so, making sure that you're maximizing your direct allocation where possible. And then what remains is the indirect.
Yeah. So yeah, this is the this is why I made that comment when we were talking about modified total direct cost base that's used in the minimus rate is you have to do this exercise. So if you've done this exercise, you've really done the simplified method. I mean, you have to add some narrative to it, a little bit more about the things we talked about submitting, but this generally is the biggest hurdle you have to cross, especially when you first started doing them, is coming up with the rationale and later to negotiate the rate. But for this, you're just doing it based on what's direct and what's indirect, and in the without looking at how do I directly allocate this.
So Carol and Nikki, so if we stopped at the simplified version, would that be enough for our indirect cost rate? Did I just like make unnecessary work for myself by doing the direct allocation method? Would they accept the simplified?
Yes. So the simplified is an allowable way of doing indirect costs. However, it's really not recommended in situations where you really can identify costs as direct, because that is your opportunity on a more consistent basis to get more back. So I think your direct allocation method, although is more in depth, and takes a little bit more time, it is worth its effort because you can apply it in so many more cases in terms of getting your full reimbursement of those costs versus a portion of them if there's limitations.
As well as
yes, and it gives you a better understanding of what the programs really are costing, because it's proportionally spread rather than it just being assuming everything receives the exact same amount of indirect.
Got it.
Which we know is not true.
Thank you.
So these exercises we're going to go through, and at the end you're going to see what would I get based on this, this imaginary.
Yes, what's the difference?
Where, what am I going to get back on de minimis versus the simplified versus the direct. Okay. So are we ready?
Okay, if there is no more questions for now, I think maybe we should take a little, I know, you guys had time to talk, but didn't necessarily have time to leave your computer and take a little break. So let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and do the next exercise, if that's okay. So it's, I don't know the time conversion, but it's 24. So let's come back at 35, whatever time it is your time.
Two.
I can't think quickly. Yeah, 2:35. There we go.
Hey,
all right, guys.
Funny. I have the most intimate conversations with my mute button. What can I say?
I know you really seem to be really getting into it.
Yeah. So anyway, I hope this is helping going through it. It does sometimes help, and sometimes it gives you more questions. So we're gonna go and are we gonna do breakout rooms again, or?
Yeah.
Okay, and go through looking at further allocating this on a direct allocation methodology. And then
sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, and then once we're done, we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk and look at the differences, including in your rate. And I think it'll re-emphasize some of the things on some of the slides that we talked about. So go ahead, Nikki.
Yeah, so I just shared the screen. So this time you're going to click on the direct allocation tab, and we're just going to have you fill out this right side. This simplified allocation was exactly what you did on the previous tab. So you just translate. I should have fixed the spreadsheet so it pulled that information over. So you just want to do the right side. And so you pay attention to what the rationale is on the different line items, and so this is more to the points we were talking about before, where you are looking at how are some of these costs direct and how are some of these costs indirect, so that you again can maximize your opportunities of direct classification so that you can get as much as you can for it. So with that, we can go out into breakout rooms, and I am sending that email right now. Let's see here. Share. And then let me send this email. Hi, everyone.
Hello. See, I didn't talk to my mute button that time. All right. So I hope this was helpful. I think, we're about trying to remember what time we are, what time zone, right? But
Yep.
So really, I think a lot of this had a lot of different conversation. I just wanted to tell people some of these allocation methodologies that we used, we just picked them up from what we saw from other people. Some of them I would never do. It's just too much work, right? But, it depends on what you spend, the amount that you can do, and, how many, is it really worth it? So there's a lot of things that you got to look at. And I'm going to let Nikki talk for a little while since she has negotiated so many rates with the feds. I've just negotiated them with the subrecipients, okay? Except for a couple agencies I was involved in where I was the CFO.
Sure. Okay, so as you guys can see my screen now, what you'll see is, I know, as the rooms that I popped in and out of, we just talked about how you would apply the ratios. It's using those allocation methods to reasonably spread the costs of certain line items of expenditures across the unallowable direct and indirect. And, as we've reiterated in our presentation in terms of making sure that we can identify as much as we can as direct, and what that does for you will be what we're going to try to show here as far as value of that exercise. So whether or not there are some of these, like for example, number of transactions processed, we didn't give you a number, so you guys can just kind of make that up. So as far as the exact amounts that have gone in here, that's really not relative. And, it's a matter of just understanding that certain types of costs can be allocated in certain ways. It is not important that you use this particular way for this type of line item cost. Again, as I get back to, it's understanding your own reasoning for why you're doing something. So like, for example, accounting fees, you might have a different basis that you think is more reasonable for your agency, and that's completely acceptable. You just have to be able to explain it in a narrative or justify the reasoning. That's really all they request that you do. And then again, year over year, you're going to want to consistently apply that. But that doesn't mean that you can't change it in the future. It just means that as much as you can be consistent, you want to be. If you're going to make changes, you have to let them know, just to put them on notice that, oh, we have a new system now. So it's important for us to change the basis because our effort has changed, whatever, that type of thing.
Right.
But as you go through this process, you're understanding which portion is direct and which is indirect. So if you notice, when we've gone through the exercise, we get 924,000 as direct versus in the simplified method, we had the 705. So to identify more dollars as direct, which one allows you to get that full reimbursement, but two, you'll notice the indirect is 187, and then we're dividing it by a larger denominator because of the fact that the direct costs are higher. So it lowered our rate from the 56.6% in the simplified method to the 19.7. So again, especially for nonprofits, I know that that's more enticing in terms of showing that lower rate. So it has, two benefits. It's not only just getting more back and assuring those reimbursements, but also representing a lower rate. But I do want to also reiterate and show how that also is something for you to take home in terms of, again, knowing that a higher indirect cost rate does not mean you're less efficient in any way, because this is the exact same scenario, just represented in a different way. So you can notice that someone on the street might think, oh, this at 19.7, you're so much more efficient than here at 56.6. And that's just not the case. It's in how you identify it. And that's unfortunate that, there's people that won't understand that process and they'll just make assumptions accordingly, but at least you can feel comfortable in your justification or how you explain the process. So that's just something to keep in mind. So what we want to
mention,
go ahead.
you get more money back.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
That's
it's a lot, but again, as Nikki pointed out, not only you get more money back, or can get reimbursed for more because you're charging it as direct, it 100% instead of what it would come out to, like the 56 or the 20. So yeah, you're going to lower it, and I agree, Nikki, 100%. People are going to go, well, that's not much higher than the de minimis, because I've seen people get it down really low. I've even seen people, and I'm sure you have, Nikki, that literally got it down to like 9%, so people question, well, why don't we take the 10%? Well, as you can see, you're going to get more money back because you're charging 100% at 100% instead of the lower indirect cost rate, which is what you would get.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to show you this in application and what that means. So at the simplified, let me just make this a little bigger and scroll down here. At the simplified allocation approach, we get a full reimbursement of $11,049.12, and what that is your total direct cost, and then your the amount of $705,638, which is your direct cost, multiplied by the percentage, and then it's $399,274. So you might wonder why we're not getting this full amount back, and that's because we have to include the unallowable in the base. So you're not going to be able to collect the indirect costs associated with that unallowable cost because you're not allocating that. So in this case, you're only getting $399,000 back instead of the 406 of indirect.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Nikki, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Did you just say in the simplified version, you don't include the unallowable costs in your base?
You do.
Okay, you do for both of them.
So yes, for both of them. All I was saying is that you're not going to get the indirect cost reimbursement. So when I'm applying the 56.6% on the 705, that only gives you $399,000 back, but really the indirect was 406. And that was because when you look at the direct cost base, it's the direct plus the unallowable. And so there's a portion of that base that you don't get to charge to anywhere of the indirect. So you're just shy of collecting all your indirect because it's got the unallowable in the base. So that's what that means. So it was a total of $11,049.12 is what you can get back using the simplified method if the grant allows for full reimbursement of indirect cost. And then based on the direct method, we have the 19.7 that's applied to the 924,104, which is your direct. So you get 181, so that's 1105. So in this case, the difference between the two is only $880 more using the direct, but that's only in a situation where you're getting a full reimbursement. So Karen, to your point about what was my point of doing this, now I'm going to show you why there's a point. So because I do see a lot of grants, they're getting better at allowing full indirect cost reimbursement, but they're not all there. So there are caps on a lot of funding for indirect costs. So when that's the case, so in my example here with a 20% admin cap, if we are only allowed to get 20%, you'll see that it is the 705 times 20%, and that equals 141. But in the direct allocation method, we get to get all of the dollars back because the 19.7 is less than 20%, and you get the 924. So you're going to get the entire reimbursement of your direct and indirect by using that method because of the fact that your indirect cost rate is less than 20%. And you've allocated as much as you can directly. So the difference in what you got back on that grant, 964,664. So that's a game changer in terms of, you know, being able to allocate things directly and then still being able to access the percentage that they have allowable for indirect. So you're getting to use both portions. But as you can also see is that you're not double dipping. You're not saying, oh, I'm capturing these indirect costs here in direct, but I'm also doing it in indirect. You can see here that they're different dollars so that you are not double dipping in any way. You can feel confident that you are getting what is rightfully yours for what you spent on this program. And then that's your opportunity to get that full reimbursement back. So that's why you want to do this method as an ideal one for especially for nonprofits, because there is that multiple method that I mentioned yesterday. And for all you guys on the call, based on what we've got as the polling question of the like between 1 and 5 million is the average nonprofit that we have on the call. I don't usually think that it's that worthwhile to go through the multiple method. And the multiple method is that cost allocation plan and the indirect cost rates unique to each program, because I just think that you're not going to get much more from that because you're really a smaller agency that is focusing on a handful of programs. So I think in that case, direct is the ideal direct method, where you're identifying where you can, and then the remainder is basically considered a simplified rate of what remains in the indirect.
So this would be the preferred method.
Right, are there any?
This would be the preferred method in your.
Yeah, in my opinion, especially for the group that we have here, I would think this is the most ideal situation where you're not spending too much time with allocation and factoring in all those pieces as a cost allocation plan, but that you're still maximizing everywhere possible the direct indirect, if you will, allowability in your rate.
Do you have any examples like this for modified total direct costs?
We don't in this type of example. We should do that, huh, Carol? Why?
Basically had some stuff that really went through every single base and every single, but oh my God, I left work and I didn't get it before I left. So I'll have to come up with that, because that is the hugest jump that you're going to see. I mean, it is just unbelievable, because really when you exclude the items, you're not really getting 10%, number one, right? And so, and then if you look at that, then, you know, and technically you're supposed to be, you know, this is a question you get a different answer. Like, am I supposed to just do the simplified allocation to use the de minimis rate? And some people will tell you yes, and some people will tell you no. So, you know, definitely ask that. But when it jumps from the de minimis, which we could probably calculate out real quick, but it is a huge, huge amount, you know?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest, I don't even know why the modified total direct cost exists in comparison to the rest, like why anyone would choose to do that, because it does give you a less reimbursement. I'm not sure why it's an option, if you will. But for example, I said this to one of the breakout rooms. I literally just got an email today from FEMA. There's a couple of auditors that I've helped them in understanding the application, like on the match component and all that stuff that they were struggling with. And so now they reach out to me to ask other questions of application. So that's a example of how cognizant agencies don't always know everything either. And so it's, you know, about collaboration and trying to make sure that they understand how it's applied and making sure their justification in their minds is right. And so I got an email today from FEMA saying, just had a quick question for you on modified total direct cost. I just want to make sure that you agree with me that, no, not that you agree with me. What are your thoughts on if capital expenditures are excluded from a modified total direct cost base, you should not apply the indirect cost rate to that, right? And so I was like, yes, if the modified total direct cost in terms of the base is excluding capital expenditures, then you're not going to apply an indirect cost to that. That's why we're saying you're going to get less, because you don't get to apply it to everything. So you're not going to apply it to capital and get 10% on that. You have to exclude it from the calculation. Therefore, you're getting less. But I had to explain to her, yeah, you don't want to apply the indirect cost rate to capital if it was excluded in the base. So it was just an interesting conversation that I thought was to me, was straightforward, in terms of the definition of modified total direct. But for her, she just wanted to make sure, and that's an auditor for FEMA. So,
Right. But
just a little side note.
when I first started creating my indirect cost rate proposal, you're given a guide for indirect cost rate determination. Okay, that's all you get. If all of us had access to this beautiful tool that you just gave us, and I looked for a year, I looked at website upon website, and I dug around to find an Excel spreadsheet that I could just plug my numbers into and work it out, but I did not find that. Where would, let's say my colleagues are going to be doing this, aside from what you've given us, is there any other like clearinghouse or warehouse that you could get these spreadsheets to help us? They give you the examples of the spreadsheets, but they don't really give you something to work with.
Well, Nikki, I don't know about you, but this is why we put this together. Okay. Is because we couldn't find anything either. And this is really only going to help like small organizations, okay? But it is a nice tool to use, all right? And so I think that's part of the reason we caught out the calculation of modified total direct cost, because I have a lot of people that ask for that spreadsheet as well. That'll automatically do it. And the problem is that, again, different federal agencies define things differently, and you don't always have all that stuff. And so we were able to do it with our school districts in the state of Illinois because they all had to follow the same chart of accounts. So it did make it easier, all right? But because different people put different things in different areas, it does make it much more difficult to do. So that's why your chart of accounts, as you can see, will become, if you're using the same allocation methodology, basically to match your chart of accounts, it makes your life so much easier instead of having to dig all that out and then put it off put another line to separate those out. Because I've seen some chart of accounts that some of the line items that they put stuff in there just didn't even make sense,
Now, let's say I used modified total direct costs in my very first indirect cost rate proposal. Can I then use direct allocation for the next one, or do I have to continue with the modified total direct costs?
You just have to let them know you have to let them know and notify them that you're going to be changing the basis of how you calculate and why. And it is okay to say, I've done more research, I've learned more, and for my organization, this is why it's important that I adjust the methodology, but moving forward, I will use this. It's just a matter of letting them know, not just submitting something completely different than what they got, because that'll send a red flag to them. But if you notify them and give the reason and justification for it, they usually don't have a problem. I had a client that went from a simplified to a multiple method. And at first they're like, you can't do that. And so I explained, and used the guidelines for my support to say, the simplified method is mostly used for organizations who only have one type of program. This was a tribe. And I said the multiple method is more reflective of their services because they provide, transportation services and health and human services and all these different types of services that really it's necessary for them to have different rates. And then they took it and they were like, yeah, okay, so you can change. So it's just about knowing that you can and just that you have to justify why and why it pertains to your organization.
But
Okay,
you
one more question. Oh, sorry, Carol.
I was just gonna say, you get to choose your base when you
Mhm.
negotiate a rate.
Yeah.
They would never elect to use the modified
Yeah.
total cost. Never.
See, that's what
It's
happens when,
cumbersome. And
when
they
you're,
yeah.
so really quickly, so the indirect cost rate proposal I got was from NOAA.
Mhm.
Now we have this this NIFWIF grant, which we are getting more money from. So does that mean that now I don't hand my new indirect cost rate proposal to NOAA anymore? I have to give it to NIFWIF because that's where I'm getting most of my money, or did I misunderstand that?
3 years. So what you have to do is that you have your negotiated indirect cost rate, and it was related to who you've gotten the most funding for 3 years. So you have a little bit of a window to still negotiate with the agency until that larger grant becomes 3 years where you've been receiving more money for 3 years. And then you have to switch. But you can use your negotiated rate that you have with NOAA on the other grant. So you can use that. So they're good. When you have negotiated your rate, they are good across the board. There are a certain couple of occasions where if it's a local agency or if there's a different regulation in the grant specifically, they might say they won't accept this rate. And if that's the case, then they have to negotiate with you. So that's, basically you would just resubmit everything to them to negotiate, but they would say, we have to do our own negotiation on that. They can't say, oh, you just don't get an indirect cost rate. Okay, any other questions on this? All right, well, our last exercise that we want to do now that you, great. Yeah, now we want to work, wait, what, Carol?
You just froze, so we didn't hear all that you said.
Oh, sorry. So the last exercise that we want to do is now that you've learned kind of the calculation process and how you go about looking at the indirect cost rate, now it's about applying it. So we want to show you what to do in a high level example, because the rate's already given to you, on how you would apply it in certain areas. So that being said, let me.
Okay, go ahead and you can pull that up. Some of the misconception, people will go back and calculate what their indirect cost rate should be and that for different programs. And you have to remember, this is the entity-wide rate, okay? So in some, you're probably gonna have a little more, and others you could have a little less, so it's not an exact science here. So don't think you did something wrong if that occurred. And this is also gonna show you why you don't want to use the modified total direct cost as a base. It's just more cumbersome to apply. And really your base should be looking at what's going to get you the most money back. Like if the majority of your costs are employees, should I use salaries and wages? Should I use just direct costs? And part of it is just what's easiest to apply. I mean, sometimes the salary and wages, your rate will be lower. But the key is whatever you negotiate, you cannot change that base. And
Right.
You'll see people try to do that. Watch that for your subrecipients and make sure whatever agreement they have includes all that information. That's usually a red flag. If you get they've gotten it from another subrecipient and they don't include, what the rate, the base, and all the information that's required in one, that's a red flag to say, ooh, I better look at this. But definitely know that sometimes you might take a little less money for the base, but it makes your life so much easier in administrating it. and applying it in the end.
Okay, perfect. This is it, Carrie. Okay, so what we're looking at here is just an application of the cost allocation plan and then the direct and indirect. So again, all of this has already been calculated. So you'll get the, you're just going to basically be applying it. Now, this is a Word document that was attached to the chat. Maybe we can attach it one more time, Sarah, just because we've had a lot of chats since then. But this is the Word document where we're just going to ask a couple questions. And then we have, what is the indirect cost rate for HHS? So this one here, based on a total program cost. What is the overall agency indirect cost rate? So that is what we're going to do first. And so remembering back from our earlier thing yesterday, as far as cost allocation and indirect cost program expenditures, the difference between them, the cost allocation is your agency-wide indirect, so your finance and HR and facilities. And then your indirect program expenditures are those of the indirect, this is more the simplified method. So this would be where your indirect cost pool includes certain staff that are administrative in nature and all that. So that's where you're given. So this is where it's wanting you to now calculate what is the overall agency indirect cost rate, which would be the entire agency. So all HHS, Department, Education and Health, using these actual full numbers versus just the HHS. So that's the first exercise. And I don't think we need to go out into break rooms for this one because it's just simple math that I think that, there's not a lot of collaboration needed for this one. So it's just looking at, what is that? And so if you use the Word document, you'll see that it kind of lists out like, okay, what is the cost allocation plan dollar? What is the indirect cost dollar for HHS? And then divided by the direct program expenditure. So it kind of walks you through how you want to do it to get your number. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to look at that.
Should we be playing Jeopardy music or what?
I know, right? We should have background music, little elevator music. Okay, next slide. I think we can go through the calculation. Okay, so for the HHS indirect cost rate, you'd have the cost allocation plan of the 175, which was listed there, because that's the indirect for finance, HR, and all of that. We have our $75,000 in program expenditures, so that's $250,000. And then it was just simply divided by the direct program expenditures only for HHS, which would give you a 50% rate. What we're looking at here is the multiple method. So it's where you're having different rates versus a agency-wide rate. So then the next slide, we're calculating the agency-wide rate. And that's where we take the cost allocation plan. So we're going to take all of the indirect agency-wide cost from each of the 4 categories. And then we're going to add the indirect program expenditures from all of the 4 categories. So that's 505. So together that's $980,000. And then our total direct expenditures is 2.3 million, which gives you a 42.61%. So what you see here and why this is valuable in understanding is basically the simplified method is that agency-wide indirect. It's that total cost divided by total direct expenditures to give you one rate. And that means for every dollar you are charging out on anything you do, you're going to get 42%, 42.61%. But if you're an agency that has multiple services that are different and how they differ in operations, then it might be valuable to you because, for example, you'll see in HHS, anything that's HHS related, you would be charging 50% indirect cost rate versus Department of Labor is 80%. So when you're looking at these dollars and why that matters is that because every grant has a different limitation, being able to look at what it's really costing, one, it's the strategic aspect, knowing what it's costing. So you might go towards more things in more programs in your agency when you're looking for new funding. You might go towards more programs that are less support on your end, or ones that will give you full reimbursement. And if they give you full reimbursement and you get 50%, it's better than the 42.61%. So that's why you want to think about it from a perspective of, are you an agency that's really just providing one type of service versus 2 very different services, or 3, whatever it might be? Excuse me. That's why you would want to use this multiple method if you are looking at it. So that's why I wanted to show it to you this way, is to be able to have that conversation to show you that. Okay, so now we're going to move to the very last exercise. And what this is looking at the application. So what's really important in understanding indirect cost, match requirements, all of that is what you were awarded versus what you've drawn down already and what remains. So if you are looking at an application of indirect costs that you have not done before, or you had, you only collected the minimum or whatever it was, and now you have a rate that you want to apply, you need to know what is left on that grant to see if you even can get your full indirect cost back, because you've already been awarded a certain amount. And then also your match requirement. What's the requirement for match, and do you have enough to cover that? So this is how you would look through to say, what is my opportunity for doing a match? Now, if you look at the years, this is something that you need to pay attention to. You can see I have years next to these programs. And when I'm talking about match, you can't go backwards, because like we said, and like Carol and I have both said, you have to get pre-approval. So the idea is if we're sitting in 2019, that would be the only opportunity you could get match if you're able to get that approval for that particular grant in that year. You can't go backwards and get reimbursement for a match you already put forth because you didn't have prior approval when you got that award. So that's something to keep in mind in this exercise, because there's different things that are in there to try to make sure that you are understanding that concept. And then also applying the rate onto your drawdown amount, which we're going to assume is all of your direct cost. And then, do you have enough remaining to capture your indirect cost? So that's the idea behind this. So if you look at your next exercise on the next page, you'll see to apply the indirect cost rate to the drawdown, and then see if there's enough remaining on the grant to draw down the remaining indirect cost. And then if it's a yes, then you'll receive the full amount. And if it's a no, you will receive the amount remaining, because that's all that's left to capture. So then the first question is, what is your match recovery opportunity in this example? Does anyone have an idea?
I'm lost.
Okay, sure, I get it. So let me step back a little bit. This is, the idea behind this exercise is just to see if we can, now we have our indirect cost rates, they're negotiated. So those are the rates on the left-hand side that you see here. And now we are an organization that is now in the middle of working on these grants that they were awarded, or if it's in a prior year, it's already completed and they've only drawn down a certain amount. So for example, the education area has a rate of 32.14%. They were awarded $2 million in grants for education purposes, but they only were able to draw down 1.75 for resource reasons or timing or whatever it might be. So they do have 250,000 remaining on that grant that they were awarded but did not collect. They did have a $200,000 match, which they already put forth. And so the percentage of indirect spent that you see here, the 562,500, is the calculation of the 32.14 times what they did actually spend of the 1.75 million. So that's what that equates to. So it's 562,500. So in my question here, the first question is the match recovery. So as you can see in the match requirement column, we have a 1.25 million match requirement from 2019 and a 200,000 match requirement from 2017. So the idea behind it is how much of the match requirement, and I'm noticing there's a 4.7 million, which is totally wrong. I don't know where that came from as a total match down there, but don't listen to that. But look at the individualized match. What is available to capture and match using the 50% for HHS or using the 32.14 for education? And you just look in the match requirement column and say, are those both available to collect, or only one, or a portion, whatever it might be? So I'll go ahead and give you guys the answer on that. So because we're going to assume we're in 2019, because it's that, and we can get prior approval for this because we have not finished this year. This year is not done. When we applied, we got prior approval, and so the 1.25 is what they can capture. The 200,000 is in the past, so we cannot go back because they did not get prior approval. We did not go back and get that 200,000 reimbursed to us that you put forth for match. So it's just showing you and knowing and making it very clear that the match requirement is a very beneficial thing to organizations to be able to use your NICRA, but it has to be pre-approved. We have to notify the funder. Okay, so the next question on the exercise of the Word document is, I'm sorry, it's not Word, it's a PDF. Yeah.
Just to go
Someone's
back.
on mute.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Can you?
Yep, I can hear you.
So I see the highlighted. So we can go back, we can get the million, but not the 250, right? Because that was from 2017.
Yeah, so the highlighted, if you look at that column, that's the additional collection. So ignore that for right now. That's for a further question. Go back to the match requirement. And so that theory is correct in terms of you can't go back and get the 200,000, but you can get the 1.25. Excuse me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions on that? Okay, so the next question is the total indirect costs spent. So you can see already we did the calculation for you. We applied the percentage related to each one of these categories to their drawdown amounts. So the drawdown is what they spent already on the grants, assuming no indirect cost reimbursement in those dollars. And then, so their total indirect spent on those dollars, you'll see 2 million on the HHS with that rate, 80,000 on the Department of Labor because they've only spent 100,000 and their rate is 80%. And then the 562,850. So your total indirect spent is 3.492 on the total direct cost of 7,850,000 under the drawdown column. And I know this can be kind of confusing, but this is something you might want to study and kind of work back when we're not in this big group and be able to see the application because it differs in each area. Like it is something you have to look on at a case-by-case basis and where is there opportunity or is there opportunity to collect in this case. So then the next question that we have is what is the total indirect cost collectible? So collectible. So what we need to do here is we look at our indirect cost that's spent is the allowable amount in terms of what you've spent on the dollars you have worked on the grant with the direct program dollars. However, if there's not enough remaining to cover it, then you can only get what is remaining because you can't increase the award in the past. So if you've already been awarded it, you can't increase it until next time when you're reapplying, but you can still access what's remaining even if it's a past grant for the last 2 years. So for example, on HHS, you'll see under the remaining column, there's $1 million. However, the indirect cost spent was 2 million. So we can't get all of it back because there's only $1 million left. So that's where the additional collection is $1 million. But when we move on to Department of Labor, because they've only spent 100,000 of the $500,000 award, they've only spent 80,000 in indirect cost support. And there's still 400,000 left, so we can use all of that. So that's 80,000. In the education, we have 562,000 spent in indirect support to support what they've already drawn down, but there's only 250,000 remaining. So that's all we can capture. So you kind of see the process, and then the additional collections allowing you to collect $2.1 million, 2.18, but the indirect spent was 3.492. So you're still subsidizing, you know, like $1.3 million, you know, $1.3 million in indirect costs, even though you have your rates and you have that ability, it's still subsidizing. So we just wanted to be able to share with you opportunities and how each one is very unique. And you have to make sure you understand, you know, you can't just go out there and say, okay, now I have an indirect cost rate. This is what I spent, so this is what you need to give me. You need to know when you go in there what's available to you, and you present that to the funder to say, okay, we need this additional amount. We spent this much, but you know, there's only this much remaining, so can we have that, please? What's remaining? So that will give you the idea of, you know, what's being done on each one of these grants. Now, I know that's a lot of information and it's very confusing. So I don't mean to confuse you, but this is just, again, an exercise in knowing that there's opportunities out there and, you know, giving you high level examples. Now, I know that there are many different cases of things that are going to throw in, you know, wrenches into these statements. And so I know we have a couple questions. One that's like, I got confused by using indirect cost rate, a percentage of the direct, and then we add indirect cost again. is the first one general administration, the second program indirect cost. Oh, that was from the prior slide. That is true, because there's the cost allocation plan is the agency-wide indirect. So that's your finance, your HR, all of those. And then the program indirect are related to the people who are in the program, but they're indirect in nature. So this is if you're not doing a direct allocation. This is if you wanted to classify it as a simplified method. So you have one indirect cost pool. So you have to add the two together to make sure you're getting all the indirect. But if you're doing the direct allocation, then all of those indirect program expenditures that we saw in that column would be classified as direct. That's the difference. So that's a good question. And then secondly, there was a question on this one that said, this is all assuming we didn't already collect on indirect, correct? And the answer is yes. So if this drawdown amount in this column included indirect costs that you did, let's say you got 10%, you would have to reduce the amount that you're collecting by that amount you already collected. So you can't double count. You have to make sure that if part of this drawdown amount includes indirect, then you need to take that out of the calculation to say, what is my direct cost that I need to apply the rate to? And then back out what's been collected in indirect. And then what remains is what you can be allowable. So that's a really good question. All right, guys. Well, and everything. So we have 10 minutes left for anyone who wants to ask any other questions about anything. And, you know, we will also share our contact information because I know a lot of things come up over time and I'm happy to answer anything. I know Carol's really good about that too. Whenever you guys have questions, you know, I can, you know, respond to emails or do anything. You guys can give me a call and I'm happy to answer these questions because it's very important for me to get as much information as we can out there and to help you guys in any way possible to share. You know, I'm happy to answer questions at any time. It's, you know, I'm not going to charge you for it or anything like that. It's just, I want to be available to you as a resource because I know there's not a lot of resources out there. You're on mute, Carol.
I think another confusing question I get asked all the time is, can I charge all my indirect costs up front? And the answer is no, because you have to spend the direct cost to qualify to apply that indirect cost rate. So you get a lot of questions too on whether or not, you know, how often we should charge them. And, you know, that really is up to you. I've seen people only do it quarterly. I've seen people do it with every billing. Okay. So it's really up to you. So overall, we have covered a lot of information very quickly. And you really do. And somebody made a comment in the chat about, you know, going back and reviewing the presentation. Yes, go back and forth. Also read some of the sites that we gave out of the 2 CFR 200 in the subpart E, and then also for matching and those matching requirements. And yes, you're going to have to go back and forth because really sometimes you glaze over things until you apply it. Once you apply it, you're like, oh my God, that's what they were talking about. Okay, I got it now. So it does take a lot of back and forth. If it's still overwhelming, and I will say this because I would tell people that really struggled when we tried to help them negotiate a rate in Illinois. Sometimes the first time, get assistance in doing it, you know? So getting assistance and putting one together and then follow that roadmap.
The problem is, Carol, where does the assistance come from? There really isn't a whole lot of information here in this packet about who to contact for help. Is it the person that you're handing in your application to? Are they supposed to be available for us? Who is really responsible for helping nonprofits do this?
Yeah, I wish I could. I wish I could say, oh, just go here. Okay. It really It really isn't. It isn't like that. Okay. Now we did it differently in Illinois because I know how important these are and we centralized it. But there were times that they still didn't completely understand what they needed to do to make it right, even after we had our contractor meet with them twice and then we would meet with them, okay, and try to walk through it. That's when we said I would go get professional assistance in putting together your first indirect cost rate proposal.
So what would you, so let's say I'm going to Google, I want to get a professional assistance. What would I Google? Professional assistance for indirect cost rate proposal?
You just say, yeah, preparation of indirect costs, you know, consultants or whatever there are. I mean, like,
Okay.
for example, I am a consultant. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. So I go into agencies and help them prepare cost allocation and then negotiate on their behalf. So I do that. There are other consultants that do that, you know, out there from different companies. So you can Google, you know, indirect cost preparation or cost allocation preparation. And then there are agencies, you know, across the board, across the nation that do that kind of service. So
Yeah.
that is what their specialties are.
I was going to say, I just Google Nikki. Okay. You know, there are a lot, you got to be really careful with some of them, you know. Number one, if they're going to brag that they get the highest rate, as you can see, rate does not equate to dollars. So that would be my first clue. I wouldn't go with them. And, you know, you definitely have to, and I wish I could tell you a sample RFP too, you know,
Yeah.
on the streets, but the only one the one I worked on was for for the state of Illinois. You know, it's a lot different, but it is I'm sure there's something out there. I don't know, Nikki, if you've seen anything. I mean, they have it for audit.
Yeah, the key, I think, in this instance is there's a lot of agencies out there that will prepare and calculate an indirect cost rate and cost allocation for you, but they don't have as much experience in negotiation. So that's where you want to make sure when you're hiring a consultant that that's part of the reference that you're asking for is, have you negotiated successfully indirect cost rates, and make sure that they have. So, you know, obviously I'm not the only consultant out there that does it, but I would say that's a differentiator that you want to make sure when you are, if that's the value that you are needing is help in the negotiation, then you want to make sure that those, because it is a different animal in knowing the guidelines and knowing how to negotiate, because it's a specific trade, I would say.
Right. You're making sure that they do have experience with nonprofits as well, you know,
Right.
so
That too.
specialize in local governments or universities, and they are totally different animals.
Very different.
Good advice. Okay, good
Yeah.
advice. And is there like what is the typical time frame that people turn these around? You know, my audit's not even finished yet, so I can't very well turn in an indirect cost rate proposal without audited financial statements, correct?
Right.
And so
Right.
what would be
Yes.
an acceptable, what would be the latest acceptable time that I could turn this into my cognizant agency?
That's a great question. So typically the guidelines state that you need to submit your rate within 6 months of the close of your fiscal year.
Thank you.
So the end of your fiscal year, excuse me. So
Yeah.
6 months, then you submit it, and then they usually have 6 months to review it. So that is there before your next fiscal year that the rate's going to be used for is starting. It might be less than that, but that's what, you know, the guidelines. Now, if it's your first year of submitting a rate, they're lenient about that. Like, even if you go back a year or something like that, they will allow you, but you'll get on a normal schedule once you've caught up. But if it's, you know, 10 months after your fiscal year and it's the first one you've done, that's not a problem. Don't not do it because of it. Just, you submit it, but, you know, you'll get on a regular cadence. You'll do one sooner the next time to catch up.
Right, and
But-
that's what happened is
But
mine was
the
like a year
guidelines say
late.
6 months. Mhm.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And if it's a first time in, you know, getting an award, negotiating a rate, it's kind of like it's the first time you got a grant, they have a 3-month, which is just ridiculous because nobody follows it. Okay. So just remember that the 6-month rule seems Duh. And then also, you know, they are lenient because we asked the same question, you know, trying to negotiate them statewide. And this is advice from our COG agency who happened to be HHS. And they said, as long as they got something in within the fiscal year, we would allow them to turn it in. But I would definitely try to do it within the 6-month frame to be able to do it. And
To
yeah,
use it within when you need to use it from is really why that's important. Because the data doesn't change. You know, the financial data is still the same, you know, a year later as it is 6 months after the fiscal year, but it's about being able for you to use it on the accurate year of grants going into it.
Can you remind me, how many years of data do you have to submit in order to, for consideration? Is it just one, or I can't remember?
You just have to submit one. If you're just wanting to do your current rate. If you have any interest in going backwards and trying to access any dollars, then you're going to need to do more than one if you haven't done one before. But typically you're just submitting one at a time, one, you know, one every year.
Thank you.
So we're right at our stopping point for today. I said before anyone else wants to jump off, I want to just give a great big thank you to Nikki and Carol. Wonderful presentation. Lots of hours in a row, lots of hours on a Zoom meeting, but obviously you guys have a ton of knowledge in this area, so I appreciate your approach to this.
yeah, and we would be very grateful if you gave us some, you know, comments on how we can
Feedback.
improve this. I go back, I think this is probably the 11th time I've done this, and I always seem to find something, and some of it's just based on talking to different people and their issues. You know, it's always nice to get those suggestions so we can make it better in the future.
Yeah, any areas that you would have liked us to go into more detail, any areas that we left out, anything like that, we'd love to hear any feedback to make it better.
Okay, well.
All right, thank you
everybody.
guys.
Had great
Take
questions.
care.
Thank you.
Great.
All right,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.